Right, guys, welcome to the Bachelor MMA. I have one half here of Cornerside MMA, Francesco. How are you, buddy?
Good man, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. I know, like I said, it's just starting out, but it's always good to make these connections.
Absolutely, man. It's an honor.
All right, let's get started. So basically, obviously, UFC 278 this past weekend, an amazing event, mainly because of the main event, sorry, because I felt that leading up to the main event, the card was sort of becoming a bit lackluster. I don't know if you felt the same way, did you?
I did. Besides the co-main event, obviously that was going to be an expected, highly anticipated fight between Rockhold and Costa. But I feel like that's the repercussions that UFC have when they book a stacked card and they can't follow it up a month later. It happens consistently. And look, throughout the fight card, it wasn't really to the casual fan appealing. Even
Yeah.
like you had the Lucy Padalova fight versus Wu Yanan, not really a fight that you put on a pay-per-view. But nonetheless, it really topped it off at the main event.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, obviously we had the Tyson Pedro fight and then the women's bantamweight fight, which I sort of was mainly looking forward to the Jose Aldo fight and up. And when I got to the Jose Aldo fight, I was a bit disappointed in how Jose Aldo not carried himself, but just didn't pull the trigger offensively. We know him to be that technical, that masterclass sort of guy, but after that first round, we just saw Marabs just wrestle him the whole time. And I don't think he realized that like the rounds were just ticking away, and like although yeah, he's like yawning and stuff like that, but he's not winning rounds. Why do you think that he wasn't so offensive? Like why do you think he was doing what he was doing?
Look, I think there's two things that I'd like to say with Jose Aldo. Now, he has been known as an explosive fighter. At 45, even back in his days in WEC, he's an explosive fighter. And I feel like there's two reasons why he's not that explosive anymore. One being that weight cut to 35 is also doing him really big harm in terms of his cardio and gas tank. And also, this fight was in Salt Lake City in Utah, where it's notoriously known for high altitude. You see a lot of fighters fatigue quite quickly, even in the Leon Edwards, Rockhold Costa. I mean, every single fighter on this card that went longer than 2 rounds really felt the altitude play into
Yeah.
hand. And so I think with Jose Aldo, I think his time at 35, it's been quite frustrating because he hasn't pulled the trigger when he should. And that's one of the most frustrating things, that it's more of a IQ standpoint. I kind of now we love the sport, we analyze the sport, we are not coaches. But if I'm his coach in the third, going into the third round, I'm telling him to throw his hands, let his hands go, and he didn't. And that's the frustrating part, because when there was no clinching involved, he wasn't active. And how are you expecting to win a fight when you're not active? And so, props to Mirab, he got the job done, but he didn't impress anyone either.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. Considering many people call him a boring fighter, where does he go like from here? Obviously, you have the bantamweight division sort of booked, like from Petr Yan to with Sean O'Malley, and then obviously you have the title fight. So where does Marab do? Does he wait? Does he go for another fight? What do you reckon he goes? What does he do from here? Considering, will the UFC push him as much? Considering that he's not that big draw that he after this fight.
And it's difficult for Murad because he is the training partner of Aljamain Sterling. Now, if Aljamain Sterling was to retain his belt against TJ Dillashaw in a few months' time, that really poses questions where he goes from here. Now, given his performance against Jose Aldo, doesn't really push himself to the title contention. Rather, you see Dana White in his post-fight interview, really not that impressed by his performance as a
Yeah.
whole to order to push him into that title contention. With Murab, it's kind of difficult because you got Corey Sandhagen versus Yong Sedong, and that's really a fun fight. You got Marlon Vera, obviously, but if I'm Marlon Vera, I'm not looking at Murab in terms of the next fight. I'm looking at someone higher up. Obviously, you've got other fighters. TJ Dillashaw fighting for the belt. Petr Yan's fighting Sean O'Malley. It's a really difficult situation because he just beat the number three ranked bantamweight in the world, and it doesn't really do him more good than you expect when you come off a win against someone like Jose Aldo.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, it's all like I said in a couple of my videos. Yeah, you can beat these type of names, but it's also the way you do it. And yeah, you have a win over Jose Aldo. Many people love to have on the come up a win over these veteran guys, but it's also the way you do it. It's very much the way you do it. Like speaking of win over
Exactly.
veteran guys, like Costa versus Rockhold, everyone's saying yeah it was a barn burner and everything like that. What do you think of like the standards? Like obviously they gassed out, but do you think that taking into consideration the altitude, do you think that they should have done better preparing for this fight?
I mean, it's hard to judge Rockhold when he hasn't won a fight in 5 years and he hasn't beaten anyone in the top six since he beat Chris Weidman for the middleweight title. So it's hard to put into standards with Luke Rockhold. However, for Costa, look, Costa is he loves these types of fights. The Yoel Romero fight, he's someone that hunts you down and catches your prey. So in terms of, sure, it was a barn burner. It was kind of wild. It was a cage fight, literally. I expected nothing less from these two fighters, assuming Luke Rockhold's mentality going into this fight is, well, I want to make it as memorable as I can because this is probably going to be my last fight. And for Costa's standpoint, this is how he wins fights. So in terms of a skill set, sure, there may have been other fighters where you look at more technical, in
Yeah,
technical
yeah.
standpoint, you're looking at other fights like, yeah, no, sure, this is a little bit more technical, but I think I personally expected, Luke Rockhold and Costa to come out the way they did.
Yeah, it was surprising that the fight wasn't finished. It sort of felt like Costa
Mm.
wasn't pulling the trigger. If for example, if someone from a betting point of view, it looked like Costa had a bet for him to win by decision. It looks like he really wasn't
Yeah.
pulling the trigger. It was weird, man.
Mm.
I thought that was going to be it. I thought he was going to knock him out. I thought Rockhold's chin wasn't going to hold up. But why didn't he finish? It looked like Rockhold mainly was literally rocked the whole fight, and Costa didn't really take advantage of it. Why do you think that? Like it's so hard to say, but why?
Yeah, look, it's a confusing one because you don't really know. I think with Luke Rockhold, he was more fatigued than hurt, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah,
And
true,
so
true.
trying to put away a fatigued fighter, it's quite tricky because you see him in the third round have these weird spurts of overhand lefts that connected on Paulo Costa. So it's a bit difficult to judge with Paulo Costa because it's something that at times, Luke Rocco looked like he was done. His body language was poor, but it's really hard to pull a trigger on someone that didn't want to quit, and that's why I think Luke
Yeah,
Rocco
true.
just stood in there for as long as he could.
Yeah, no, I thought of that as well. I heard the commentary team say that as well because even though he was fatigued, he was also very awkward, very unorthodox. Like,
Mm.
he just randomly get these bursts of energy. That's what it seemed like. And obviously, we have that famous clip where he said, "Fuck you" and shit, and like he punched him and called him a bitch. And yeah, but I don't
Iconic.
know. I said it in my YouTube video. This fight's a weird one in my opinion because what is it? It doesn't really give much clarity to the division. I thought it was just put together just for the excitement. I said Jose Aldo should have been the co-main, but then I feel like they expected a really crazy fight going into the main event. People were hyped. I felt like that was going to happen. But what does Costa like? What does a win over Rockhold mean? Like, where does Costa go from here? Like, he sort of proved, not proved, but obviously his outing against Izzy proved that you can't really hang with Izzy. So what does he do now?
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of contenders at the moment where they just can't have success with the champion. You look at Colby Covington,
Yeah.
for example, prior to Leon Edwards. You look at, Max Holloway with Volkanovski. Now, with Costa's fight at 85 against Rockhold, I really thought this was a UFC test just because of the circumstances. Sorry, with Marvin Vittori going into their fight with the 205 situation. Now, um, it's kind of difficult because the middleweight division is quite packed right now, and there's a lot of fights being booked. And so I think UFC weren't really too sold on Costa coming back to 85. I think Dana White was publicly stating that this was going to be his last fight at middleweight before the Vittori fight. So now that he missed weight by a lot, they really didn't have enough trust in him to get down to that point. So I don't think they would have pushed anyone for a ranked opponent for Costa, given his history prior to this fight. But it's hard to go from here because Luca Rockhold wasn't ranked. Uh, in a terms of a fight standpoint, I think it was a great fight to pick, considering Jared Cannonier's fighting. He was fighting against Izzy. Izzy was booked. Sean Strickland. Alex Pereira was booked. Vittori versus Whitaker. I mean, if you're Costa, who else do you have? And so, if you wanted to fight at that time, and that's the only offer that they gave was Lou Rockhold, then so be it.
Yeah, I guess, like I said, it's also the excitement, and it's a good fight to book.
Mm,
It's a fun fight, like you said. Costa loves these fights. It's the fights that he thrives on, and honestly, I feel like Costa's taken that route after the Izzy fight to be that comedy guy. That I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, but all of his
classic.
antics and stuff like that. So I feel like this fight for Costa just hypes him up in that way, just for the
Absolutely.
for the fan boost and like stuff like that. I feel like yeah, it's just a good fight for him. Although like I said in my video, it doesn't provide a lot of clarity, but not all fights need that. Not all fights need that crazy backstory. Some fights are just there for the fan appeal, and I think this one was that one.
100%.
So obviously now we have the main event. Sorry, were you gonna say something?
No, I just said I was in agreement with you. I said
Oh, okay.
100%.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
cool. So obviously the main event, I have many, many words to say about this because I love Leon Edwards. And look, don't get me wrong, I love Kamaru Usman and I think he's great. And obviously one of the welterweight greats. Obviously, you can't deny what he's done as a champion. But I said it in my breakdown that he's underestimating Leon. I think the fame's getting to his head. I think the way at the presser, the antics, all the stuff like all the stuff like that. I feel like he was underestimating him, and it gave me vibes when he fought Tyron Woodley, and Tyron Woodley is sort of just this stone cold, like um, underestimating him, and that happened. Obviously, Usman dominated that Woodley fight, but I just never counted Edwards out. How did
Mm.
you feel going into that fight? Did you think Edwards had a chance at all?
I definitely did. I definitely did respect him, but in terms of the way, Kamaru Usman was looking, going into, the Leon Edwards fight. Sure, he was inactive. He hasn't fought since Colby at Madison Square Garden. I still had no reason to go elsewhere. I didn't have that feeling that Leon Edwards could pull it off, considering the first fight, how it went down. I could very well and truly see the first fight playing out in exactly like the second fight playing out exactly like the first fight, and it kind of did. But look, you never know in MMA, and that's why you in boxing you have that reference of he's got a puncher's chance. Well, Leon Edwards definitely does have that punching chance going into the fifth round. Going into the fight, I did predict Usman to win, but I mean you can't write anyone off, and you can't really write Leon Edwards off considering his backstory and his
Yeah.
kind of path to get to the title was kind of remarkable.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, it's really hard to bet against Usman. It doesn't mean that,
Yeah,
I think Leon's gonna like kill him or whatever. I just think that it's even if Leon Edwards is one of my favorite fighters, like based on what Usman's done in that division, you can't really bet against him. You know what I mean? So my friends were telling me, "Oh, but you picked Usman." But no, I picked Usman based on this division.
yeah,
I never counted Leon Edwards out. I said if you picked him apart, if he stayed at range and did what he and does what he does, but I just don't get how people can call that a fluke. I tweeted it. I said, what how would that would have changed if he threw that kick in the first, he threw that kick in the second, the
mm,
third. It was he outstruck him in that exchange. Do you know what I mean? It's not like you see these fights like Molly McCann when they're all bloodied up and she just spins a spinning back fist from nowhere. And they're the type of ones who, oh yeah, it was a fluke, she got caught. But this one was precise. It was as calculated as you come. It was as Leon Edwards as you get. So people say, oh, it's a fluke. He was getting dominated. Yeah, he got dominated, but how does that change the result? He outstruck him. He found a
yeah.
weakness in Usman's game and he outstruck him. So what do you say to the people that say that it's a fluke? It was a fluke.
It's absurd. Now with the head kick, it's a perfectly set up 1-2 feint, and it's a strike that everyone throws. Now, can you land it in some circumstances? Sure, maybe, but sometimes people either defend it differently. In Usman's case, he defended it incorrectly, and so it wasn't a lucky shot because he planned that with and he's executed it so many times throughout his MMA career that he knows that strike and that's his bread and butter. So
Yeah.
in terms of the whole grand concept of the fight, he's got 58 seconds to do it. Well, you kind of reiterate, well, in terms of a lucky shot, it means that he didn't mean it. It means that it
Yeah,
was kind of,
yeah,
incidental. In terms of a haymaker, this was a beautiful. He knew what it was going into with that setup head kick, and Usman fell for his trap, and it was a beautiful setup. And you can't really
yeah.
say it was a flick regardless because it was just a technical strike to throw, and it was a calculated one at the same time.
Yeah, no, I was going crazy. Like I was on the way home. The bad thing about what I do, I work and I have my contracted shift on Sundays. So I used to have Sundays free to have the UFC days. I used to bring the popcorn and everything. However, I still watch every fight. I sort of have my AirPod in under my beanie and everything like that. However, I finish at 3, and that's where the main event usually is. And I was on the way home in the car. I put it on my speedo, and I went crazy. I was screaming. I was mainly happy just for obviously the come up and how the trials and tribulations to get to this fight. Like, how did you react? I was going crazy. I lost my voice.
Yeah, I did. I remember doing a live afterwards. I couldn't even talk. I was kind of like you. I think like everyone as well, lost their voice. I was in a state of shock. I really thought I wouldn't see the day that Usman would get KO'd stiff like that. I
Yeah,
really thought it wasn't possible. To beat him, maybe ease out a decision, but to see him just go down like that, in terms of just the fight going the way it was, and by the way, he was going into this fifth round a minus 5,000 betting favorite. Now, for you guys that we are Australian, we don't really go by those metrics, but that's technically a 98% chance of winning. And so going into probably the last second, you're probably looking at those odds 99.2%, for example.
yeah, yeah,
To see that happen the way it did was just something that you just say, whoa, what a sport. And I've always said this is one of the greatest sport, if not the greatest sport in the world right now, because you never know. It's so
yeah,
unpredictable.
yeah, yeah. It's not a sport like I was listening to an interview where a lot of these sports where in the final minute, if someone's winning, it's basically done, like in soccer or in basketball. But like I said, in this sport, the last minute doesn't mean anything. It's not like obviously there's scorecards, but it's not like there's a score tally, like in many of these other sports. So that's why it's just amazing. So what I was gonna ask you is everyone's already counting Leon out in for the trilogy based on this fight. But I have a bit of a rebuttal, and let me know what you think about this. So, obviously, we have the altitude and everything like that, and Leon has stated publicly that after that first round, his body basically shut down. Basically, didn't know what was going on, and in his interview, his worst performance of his career, he's saying his worst performance he's ever had, and he knocked out the pound for pound king. Obviously, leading up to that event, he didn't look great in the fight, but perfect assuming he has for the next fight, perfect camp, no altitude, and he has his best performance or even any better than what he had, surely it's not as one-sided as this fight. Surely in the next fight, if everything goes well for Edwards, it's a closer fight.
I somewhat agree. And I believe going into the trilogy fight, which will definitely happen, probably you're looking at early next year, I'd still think Kamaru Usman's the favourite going into that fight. But I definitely think that I think, and what I assume, I think Leon Edwards went to Utah 2 weeks prior, which really doesn't do much in terms of training
Yeah,
for the
exactly.
altitude. You got to live there to adjust to it. Like you saw, I'm not too sure if you remember the Cain Velasquez versus Fabricio Verdun fight, where this was at high altitude and Cain Velasquez just plummeted, and
Yeah,
Fabricio Verdun just took over. And so I feel like, at a neutral standpoint, they're possibly discussing England for Leon Edwards to
yeah,
defend his belt, home territory. You're definitely looking at a more competitive fight. I think throughout rounds 2 and 4, he got taken down quite easily. And that was one of the things that I was very surprised in. And it's probably due to the fact that he was not prepared for the Utah altitude, which really depleted his gas tank. But I
yeah,
feel like this can be a more, like you saw in the first round, a more competitive grappling match going into that trilogy fight. Because even in the first fight, that grappling exchanges, Leon was doing well, and he's improved
yeah,
drastically since
yeah,
that first fight in terms of his grappling. He took Usman down, and I would assume he has some success in the grappling department. And I definitely think he can do it again. But I'm still going towards, Usman having this chip on his shoulder now, somewhat as an underdog now, someone that now has to face adversity. I think Kamaru Usman can come away with it. Now, this is an early prediction or whatever, but I think that this is really a benefit for Kamaru Usman in terms of his career. He has to suffer adversity like every champion does, and I think he can rise to the occasion, although I wouldn't be surprised if Edwards can get it done.
Yeah, that's what I said leading up to this fight. I'm picking Usman, but I will not be surprised. And I think it will be a way more competitive fight given, home territory, praying for a perfect camp, whatever. But you've seen these older guys. Usman's like 35, yeah? You've seen these older guys get KO'd like that brutally and they don't come back perfectly, yeah? So what are the chances that Usman isn't the same after this? He's looking good on his in his story, he's looking in high spirits, but at the end of the day, how how can this change his career? What happens if he's not the same anymore?
And look, you're right. Once your chin gets cracked, it becomes weaker, significantly weaker when you get KO'd for the first time. Now, for Usman's case, I am not too worried about his chin because he barely gets hit. Like he does cop a few shots, and he does get wobbled, like you saw in the Colby Covington fight,
Yeah, yeah.
etc. But they're not haymakers. He's really got some underrated defense in the striking department. So I wouldn't be too worried about Usman if he was a fighter that is known to engage in some brawls and you hit me once, I'll hit you twice type thing. I would raise a bit more concern. But yeah, look, yeah, he can definitely get cracked and become less durable to shots in the future, and that's going to happen. But I think to hit him is really easier said than done. So hopefully, given his age at 34, I think 34, 35, mid 30s now,
Yeah,
that doesn't really help you out. But at least this was the first time he's ever been finished like that. Because if this was the second or third time, then it starts to get weaker and
yeah,
weaker and weaker.
yeah. Like it's such a hard fight to go back into, but Usman ultimately deserves it. Yeah, so it's not like the easiest title defense in the world for Edwards, but he does deserve it given how dominant of a champion he was and how the fight ultimately was playing out. But I just really want to see Edwards defend his belt. Like I really want him to win, but just Usman's such a hard first title defense. And I'm not picking I'm not this is not me saying Usman's definitely gonna win, but the probability is based on this fight as well, I'm high percentage leaning towards Usman. So everyone's on Twitter now, Jorge Masvidal's coming out of the woodworks and stuff like that. People are saying, oh, given the backstory, backstage when he hit him and stuff like that. Would you entertain a Jorge Masvidal title fight?
No,
No, I
never,
was, yeah, I was saying it
never.
as well. The guys had two shots at it. The guys
Yeah,
had two shots. He's ultimately, other than that Ben Askren knockout, and obviously he's had other highlights in his career, I don't see him as a guy that can hang with those guys. Not at all. And I feel like his words and his actions literally push him further than what his skill does, what his fighting ability actually does. So if I'm Leon Edwards, I've said it before, like speaking as him, that he's wanted to fight Usman. He wants to do it back home. And like, for the people that are saying, "Oh, give Jorge the shot," there's history there. Or if Nate somehow pulls it off against Hamza, oh, give it to Nate. It's just unlikely. Dana White literally. Usman freaking called Dana White at the press conference saying your champs fuck up sometimes too. They're gonna give it to Usman. That's the reality, and that's how it should be. None of these stupid fights Jorge Masvidal. Like, of course, now he comes out of the woodworks. You know what I mean? Like, I think with these type of fights, you need to run it back straight away. But what I'm scared of is sort of like what we saw with Nunez and Pena, where we saw Pena win. She had all this praise, just like Leon does, and then she gets corrected. Sort of like there's a course. She took the loss, and now she's back on course. So it sort of doesn't like now we think of Pina. We don't think of Pina as as a champion. We just think of someone that she had a mishap and now she's back. Nunes is back on track. Yeah. So if Usman picks up this win, obviously Leon Edwards won the belt in more spectacular fashion and is the second British champion ever. But I just fear that when it's all said and done, we'll just think that Kamaru took an L and got right back. Do you think that it'll tarnish tarnish what Edwards did at all?
Not at all. And this is why, see, I'm very high on Amanda Nunes. Now, I'll go to my grave and defend that Amanda Nunes is in top five greatest of all time. And that's because although she lost to Pena, although Edwards beat Usman, look at GSP. He lost to Matt Serra. So great fighters deal with adversity. How many times do you see fighters that avenge their loss? And so if Usman was to avenge his loss against Edwards, then his reputation, his legacy does not really tarnish because he's 2-1 against Edwards then, and so he can go back on track and becoming, in his eyes, the greatest of all time.
Absolutely,
not in my eyes, his eyes.
That's another thing I'm talking about. All this ghost.
I don't say.
Yeah, so you don't believe that Usman's the welterweight GOAT? After this fight, I don't think you can say that. I don't think you can say that he's the GOAT after this.
No. Yeah, and that's why I feel like it's a bit difficult judging greatness when they're still fighting. I like to judge fighters when it's all said and done, especially how competitive it is between him and GSP. But for now, definitely GSP is still at 1. But who knows in a few years' time if Usman can get back there.
All right, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. Right now I have GSP there, but I'll see what Usman does in the future. Look, I've only got 4 minutes left in this Zoom call or else I have to pay for a stupid subscription. So look, I thank you for coming on. Thank you for giving me a shot. I appreciate your expertise, your knowledge, and thanks for coming on.
Pleasure, man. We'll keep doing these more often than not, all right?
Absolutely,
It's been fun.
Thank you so much, man.
Thank you. Have a good one.